Hello, my name is Wendy Truscott. I'm a member of the Muskoka Authors Association and the Bracebridge and Baysville Library Writers Circle. And I'd like to begin by thanking the Bracebridge Library, especially Catherine Rodney and Sarah McNeil, for this opportunity to talk about my two novels, both of which are set in Muskoka circa 1880. It was 4 years ago that I had the pleasure of speaking to a group at this library to introduce my first novel, Haunted Journey. And today I'm thrilled to be back to tell you about my new one, MacGregor's Curse, which can be seen as a sequel to Haunted Journey, but it's also a standalone story. People often ask what led to my writing a novel. I can't say it's something I ever aspired to do, but several years ago my husband and I joined the memoir writing group at the Baysville Library, and within a couple of years, our leader, the late Melody Richardson, challenged the group to venture into fiction. This was intimidating, and for my first piece, I chose to write about a pioneer woman with 4 children struggling in the backwoods of Muskoka. Melody insisted this was the beginning of a novel, and despite my initial resistance to the idea, 4 years later, Haunted Journey was published. To my great surprise, readers insisted there had to be a sequel, because they needed to know what happened to the characters. For any writer, that's quite a compliment. Why did I choose to write about Muskoka? Perhaps because of my own family's almost pioneer-like experience when we first came here. It's a familiar story to many older cottagers in Muskoka. In 1953, my parents bought a point of land on beautiful, tranquil Echo Lake, and with that, our own pioneering adventure began. With no road in, we blazed a trail using an axe to mark trees so as not to get lost, and for a couple of years carried supplies about half a mile in, usually by flashlight on Friday nights. After clearing the land, Dad rafted building supplies across the lake to our site. We were quite isolated, with no neighbors for half a mile, no electricity, TV, or telephones. At night, we read or played cards by coal oil lanterns, and in the daytime, we had half a lake to ourselves and plenty to explore. But Dad put us to work too, pulling up roots and shrubs, fetching tools, and assisting him with some of the carpentry. While this felt like a pioneer existence, and was in some respects, I am completely aware that we also had the luxury of jumping in the car and returning to the creature comforts of the city on Sunday nights. Through this experience, however, I developed a hearty respect for both the early settlers and the indigenous peoples and the history of this area. I've been fortunate to speak to many old-timers and have inserted a couple of their stories in my books. Now I'd like to read to you from my second book, MacGregor's Curse. What's it about, you well may ask? Here is a brief excerpt from the back cover blurb. Overcoming grief for his dead mother and the estrangement of his once happy and proud family lead young Jamie MacGregor to commit an act of revenge he immediately regrets. Lacking purpose, confidence, and friends, Jamie falls under the spell of a dangerous blackmailer. There's much more to it than that, of course, but for now I've chosen to read a part of Chapter 1 and then skip to part of Chapter 2. Chapter 1 is called The Outsider. Jamie MacGregor was on a mission. Call it revenge, call it justice. He didn't care about words. He needed to act. In the tiny village, the handful of cabins and sheds he surveyed lay as silent and deserted as a cemetery at midnight. The occasional drip of melting snow from their roofs provided the only sound, aside from his own breathing. No dogs barked, no wagon wheels creaked along the still frozen track, no farmers gossiped outside the general store. He noted its drawn window shades. The business was closed, a rare occurrence indicating the importance of the day. Until recently, the surrounding trees had bowed low under the weight of heavy snow. A recent thaw had laid bare their branches, allowing him a clear view of the area. However, he would also be more visible. Moving forward, he avoided the muddy main route and passed through a small woods. In the far distance, he noted an unusual shape rising along the riverbank and the soft sound of rushing water, identifying it as the new mill. Emerging from the thick trees, he approached his planned destination from the rear. The imposing two-story clapboard residence had always impressed him, as it stood in stark contrast to the simple log cabins most people occupied. After a few minutes' surveillance, he was able to confirm the doctor was not seeing patients on this day. Instead, most of the villagers had already gathered inside, waiting for the special occasion to begin. He had come for the same event, but with a different purpose. He would wait alone on the outside. In front of the house, a patient horse, hitched to a carriage, also waited. Close to a side window, Jamie spied a tree thick enough for his purpose. He approached it with stealth, keeping an eye on the horse, not wanting to spook it and alert others to his presence. Reaching the safety of the tree, he flattened himself against it. He was grateful for its size and ideal location. With his height and broad shoulders, he'd be well hidden. Despite winter's chill, nervous sweat poured down his face, blurring his vision and stinging his eyes, but he didn't dare try to wipe it away. Even though he was sure he couldn't be seen, it wasn't worth risking someone detecting the movement. He held his breath and listened. A deep grunt and the scraping of wood on wood indicated someone pushing up the lower half of a stiff window, releasing a mixture of merry voices onto the still air. At that happy sound, a white-hot rage shook his body. What right did they all have to be so happy? But he couldn't afford to lose control now. He'd planned for so long and chosen his moment carefully. He would have only this one chance. He had to get it right. The voices had stopped. His heart raced. He'd lost track of time. How long had he been standing there? Had he missed the moment? No, he couldn't. He had to do this. Leaning closer, as far as he dared without being seen, he strained to listen until at last a man's voice rang out. "I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss the bride." Unclenching his fist, Jamie hefted the sizable rock he'd been squeezing so hard his fingers ached, placed it in his slingshot, pulled back hard, and let it fly. The shattering sound of the missile smashing through the glass at the top half of the window provided a fleeting moment of satisfaction before screams erupted inside. He ducked back behind the tree as the familiar red face of his neighbor, Jim Wiley, leaned out the window, scanning the surrounding bushes. "Who's out there?" he shouted, shaking a fist. "By God, you'll pay for this, whoever you are! Bastard!" Quick, he only had a moment to crouch down and half run, half crawl into the bush and get as far away as he could before the others, now pouring out the front door, could spot him. He was fast on his feet, and with a bit of a head start, he knew he could outrun any of the others. Even if one or two mounted up, he knew the paths and trails where a horse couldn't get through the underbrush. Now skip to chapter 2, where Jamie is just watching the last of his captors. The others had given up. Jamie watched Caleb, wearing that fine suit of clothes and boots, surveying the banks on the other side of the river for footprints, and was certain he'd turn back. No one would be crazy enough to ruin such an outfit by continuing to give chase. As someone who'd never worn anything but his brother's beat-up hand-me-downs, he couldn't believe his eyes when the idiot plunged through the freezing water without a moment's hesitation. Was he insane? He must be pretty damn mad, he thought, shaking his head in disbelief at the sight of the wet and trembling figure stomping around for warmth and shouting curses at the sky. Jamie was pleased with the havoc he'd caused, and felt more than a little smug, too. It was only by knowing where there were stepping stones in the stream that he'd been able to stay dry himself. When the bedraggled figure turned back towards the wedding, slumped in a posture of defeat, Jamie allowed himself to relax. He didn't know Caleb Lawson. He'd only seen him around, but he didn't want to get into a confrontation with him right now. Not that he was a coward, but he'd heard the rumors. The kid had run away for a couple of years, and despite the fact he claimed he'd been up north working in a mine, some suggested he'd been in jail. Who cared where he was? Jamie didn't need the aggravation. He had his own problems. Lately, there'd been days when he'd thought about taking off himself. But where would he go? As always, his first thought was he could go to his older brother, Robbie. How he missed him. He wasn't far away, a couple of miles, but he might as well be living on the moon for all Jamie saw of him these days. Robbie had always watched out for his younger brother, but now he had a wife and his own place to take care of, and Jamie suspected his new sister-in-law wouldn't be too pleased about taking him in. He turned away from the cave's hidden opening and kicked at the ground. Well, who needed her anyway? Although the day was unusually mild for February, his hiding spot was damp and cold. He had no intention of leaving for a while in case others were searching for him. He couldn't risk a fire, but he didn't mind. He liked it here. He'd found this cave back when he was about 9 or 10, and he never told anyone about it. It was his special place, and he wanted to keep it that way. He figured it must have been a bear's den at some time, but he hadn't found any evidence bears used it now. Maybe his human smell lingered and scared them off. He was careful never to leave any food around to attract animals, but he had hidden a few special items there, treasures he'd found while out exploring, some Indian arrowheads, a snake skin that had been shed almost intact, an intricately patterned partridge feather, and the skull of a deer that wolves had probably brought down. They were a child's treasures, but he was no longer a child. He was 16, almost 17, a man. And today he had acted like a man. He'd had his revenge when he picked up his slingshot and smashed that window. Jamie clenched his fists in anger and frustration. After all his careful preparations and the successful execution of his plan, he should be experiencing a tremendous sense of satisfaction. But he wasn't. He felt strangely let down. He couldn't understand it. He'd done the right thing, hadn't he? No one else was doing anything, so it was up to him. Maybe that rock wasn't enough. He might have to come up with something else, something big. He curled up on the floor of the cave. Painful memories of the past flooded back, and a tear slid down his cheek. So deep was his hurt, he didn't attempt to hold it back. I hope you enjoyed the reading and that I've piqued your interest. If you'd like to order copies, please visit my website, wendytruscott.com, or email me at wendytruscott@yahoo.com. Thanks for listening.